In the spring of 1869, 4 years after the war supposedly ended slavery, something happened on a Louisiana plantation that newspapers refused to print and officials wanted buried. A girl named Dinah, a master dead in a way that made grown men flinch, and a hanging that drew a crowd of thousands who couldn't decide if they were witnessing justice or atrocity. If stories about what happens when the law protects monsters matter to you, about the terrible things people do when pushed past human limits, then stay with me. Because what Dinah did in 1869 tells you everything you need to know about revenge, and why some people believed she deserved a medal instead of a noose. The year 1869 sits in a strange place in American history. The Civil War had ended in 1865. Slavery was officially abolished by the 13th Amendment. Reconstruction was supposedly bringing rights and justice to freed slaves across the South. But in rural Louisiana, in parishes where federal oversight was minimal and old power structures remained intact, slavery hadn't really ended. It had just changed names. Sharecropping, convict leasing, debt peonage. These were the new systems that kept black people in bondage. The chains were economic and legal now instead of literal iron, but they were just as effective. Maybe more so, because now the oppression could hide behind contracts and laws instead of being openly acknowledged. Cypress Grove Plantation sat deep in Lafourche Parish, surrounded by swamps and accessible only by rough roads that turned to mud in rain. It was 2,100 acres of sugarcane worked by people who were technically free, but practically enslaved. The owner was Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, 49 years old, French Creole, wealthy and absolutely furious that the war had cost him his property. He'd spent 4 years finding ways to recreate slavery under different names, and by 1869, he'd largely succeeded. Rousseau's workers were all former slaves who'd signed labor contracts they couldn't read. The contracts bound them to work for minimal wages that were immediately eaten up by charges for food, housing, and tools. Try to leave and you'd be arrested for breach of contract or theft of the master's property. Refuse to work and you'd be charged with vagrancy and sent to a work camp that was worse than any plantation. It was slavery with paperwork, bondage wrapped in legality, and Jean-Baptiste Rousseau ran it with an iron fist. Dinah arrived at Cypress Grove in March 1869. She was 15 years old, though she looked younger, small, thin, with the kind of malnutrition that stunted growth. She'd been born into slavery on a different plantation, freed technically in 1865, but had spent the intervening years being passed from one exploitative situation to another. Her mother had died during the war. Her father, if she'd ever known him, was gone. Dinah had no family, no protection, no resources. She was exactly the kind of person Rousseau looked for, vulnerable, alone, easy to control. Rousseau purchased Dinah's labor contract from a man in New Orleans who specialized in trafficking freed slaves back into bondage. The contract bound her to work at Cypress Grove for 5 years in exchange for housing, food, and $3 a month. $3 a month, $36 a year. In 5 years, she'd earn $180 total, assuming Rousseau actually paid her instead of finding reasons to withhold wages, which he always did. Dinah arrived in chains, literally. Rousseau claimed it was to prevent escape during transport, but really it was to make a point. You might be technically free, but here, you're mine. She was put to work in the cane fields immediately. Sugar cane is brutal labor. The stalks are thick and have sharp edges. The work is constant bending and cutting. The Louisiana sun beats down without mercy. During harvest season, workers labored 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, until every stalk was cut and processed. Dinah worked alongside 40 other people, all in similar situations, trapped by contracts, by debt, by the simple fact that there was nowhere else to go. They lived in cabins that were barely standing, ate food that was barely adequate, and lived under the constant threat of violence from Rousseau and his overseers. But Dinah tried to make it work. She was 15 years old and had known nothing but hardship her entire life. This was just more of the same. She could endure it. She would endure it. For the first 3 weeks, Rousseau barely noticed her. She was just another worker, one of many, not particularly strong or skilled, just another body in the fields. Then he saw her face. Rousseau's wife had died 2 years earlier. He had no children. His only regular company was the overseers he employed and the occasional business associates who visited. He was lonely, frustrated, and had grown accustomed during slavery to taking whatever he wanted from the women he owned. Technically, he didn't own Dinah, but in practice, the distinction barely mattered. He started summoning her to the big house. At first, it was for legitimate work, cleaning, serving meals, doing laundry. The house slaves, as they still called them, were envious. Working in the house was easier than field labor, and Dinah was getting that privilege after only a few weeks. But the older women knew better. They saw the way Rousseau looked at Dinah. They'd seen that look before, during slavery, and they knew what it meant. A woman named Celeste, who'd been at Cypress Grove for 3 years, tried to warn Dinah. You stay away from Master Rousseau when you can. Don't never be alone with him. If he calls you to his room, make noise, drop something, get other people to come running. Why? Dinah asked. Celeste looked at her. This tiny 15-year-old girl, who'd somehow survived 15 years in hell, but still had innocence in her eyes. Because he'll hurt you, child, and there ain't nobody going to stop him. The first assault happened on a Tuesday evening in April. Rousseau had sent all the other houseworkers away and called Dinah to his bedroom to help change the linens. When she entered, he locked the door behind her. Dinah was 15 years old and weighed maybe 90 pounds. Rousseau was a grown man, over 6 feet tall, strong from years of overseeing manual labor. When she tried to resist, he hit her hard enough to split her lip. When she tried to scream, he covered her mouth with his hand and told her that if she made noise, he'd have her whipped in the yard in front of everyone. So Dinah stopped resisting. Let her body go limp. Let her mind go somewhere else while he did what he wanted. Afterward, Rousseau gave her a coin, a nickel, and told her to keep their special time secret, as if it were consensual, as if she had any choice. Dinah stumbled back to the quarters, her body aching, her lip bleeding, her soul somewhere far away. Celeste took one look at her and knew exactly what had happened. "I'm sorry, baby," Celeste whispered, cleaning Dinah's face. "I'm so sorry." "Can I report him? To the authorities?" Celeste's laugh was bitter. "Child, he is the authorities. The sheriff is his cousin. The judge is his friend. You're a freed slave and he's a white landowner. Who do you think they'll believe?" "Then what do I do?" "You survive. That's all any of us can do." But surviving for Dinah meant being raped 2, 3 times a week. Rousseau developed a pattern. He'd summon her in the evenings when other workers had been dismissed, assault her in various rooms of the house, then send her away with small gifts that he pretended were generous rather than insulting. The other workers knew what was happening. Some tried to protect Dinah by volunteering for housework themselves, but Rousseau would just send them away and demand Dinah specifically. Others avoided her, as if association with a rape victim might contaminate them or draw Rousseau's attention to them. Dinah became isolated. The assaults continued, and something inside her began to break. At first, she cried every night, lying on her pallet in the cabin she shared with 6 other women, sobbing quietly into her thin blanket. But crying didn't help. It didn't change anything, just made her feel weaker. Then she tried to disappear mentally. During the assaults, she'd imagine she was somewhere else, by a river, in a forest, anywhere but in that room with that man's hands on her body. But her mind would always snap back to reality when he hurt her particularly badly, and the technique stopped working. Finally, she got angry. It started as a small spark, buried deep under layers of pain and fear. But it grew, fed by every assault, every humiliation, every moment when she had to smile and say, "Yes, master," to the man who was destroying her piece by piece. The anger grew until it was all she had, until it was the only thing keeping her alive. Because without that core of rage, there'd be nothing left but despair, and despair would kill her. By June, 3 months after arriving at Cypress Grove, Dinah was no longer the frightened girl who'd arrived in chains. She was something harder, colder, more dangerous, though no one recognized it yet. She began to watch Rousseau differently, studying him, learning his patterns, understanding his vulnerabilities. She noticed that he drank heavily in the evenings, that by 10 o'clock he was usually drunk. She observed that he kept a pistol in his nightstand, but rarely loaded it. She saw that he was careless, confident in his power, never imagining that someone like Dinah could be a threat. That confidence would be his undoing. Dinah also began to pay attention to the plantation's physical layout, where the knives were kept in the kitchen, which doors locked from the inside, where the overseers slept, and when they made their rounds. She wasn't planning anything specific yet, just gathering information, the way you'd collect kindling before starting a fire. In July, Rousseau started getting rougher. The assaults became more violent, more degrading. He'd been drinking more, was more frustrated about something, business problems maybe, or just boredom. Whatever the reason, he took it out on Dinah's body. One night, he hurt her badly enough that she couldn't work the next day. Bruises covered her arms, her ribs were cracked, she could barely walk. Celeste had to tell the overseer that Dinah was sick with fever to explain why she couldn't go to the fields. That night, lying in the cabin and hurting all over, Dinah made her decision. She couldn't endure this for 5 years. Couldn't survive it, not with her soul intact. Rousseau was going to kill her eventually, if not directly, then by breaking her so thoroughly that she'd have nothing left to live for. So Dinah decided he would die first. Not quickly, not mercifully. He was going to suffer the way he'd made her suffer. He was going to know pain and fear and helplessness. He was going to understand what he'd done, and he was going to die slowly, knowing that it was Dinah, little, powerless Dinah, who'd done it to him. The planning took weeks. Dinah was patient, methodical, careful. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. She'd have one chance, and it had to count. She started by gaining access to the house more freely. Volunteered for extra work, showed up early, stayed late. Made herself indispensable so that her presence in the house wouldn't seem unusual. She learned where everything was kept: food, medicine, tools, weapons. She memorized Rousseau's routine down to the minute. She studied the other house workers' schedules so she'd know when she'd be alone. She also began stealing small items: a length of rope from the barn, a knife from the kitchen, nothing fancy, just a paring knife that wouldn't be missed, a bottle of laudanum from Rousseau's medicine cabinet. He took it for headaches and wouldn't notice if the level decreased slowly. Each item was hidden carefully. The rope coiled in a crack in the cabin wall, the knife wrapped in cloth and buried near the privy, the laudanum transferred to a small vial she'd found discarded. By late August, Dinah was ready. She just needed the right opportunity. It came on August 23rd, 1869. The harvest was beginning, which meant all the field workers were laboring from dawn until well after dark. The house staff was reduced to essential personnel only. Everyone else was needed in the fields. Rousseau had dismissed his overseers early because he wanted privacy. He'd summoned Dinah to his bedroom. It was a situation Dinah had experienced dozens of times. But this time would be different. She arrived at his door carrying a tray with his evening brandy, as he'd requested. The brandy contained enough laudanum to make him drowsy, but not enough to be immediately suspicious. Rousseau drank it while discussing the harvest, complaining about lazy workers, treating Dinah like she was furniture that could listen. Within 30 minutes, he was yawning. "I'm tired," he announced. "Help me prepare for bed." Dinah helped him undress, hung his clothes, turned down his bed. Rousseau climbed in, already half asleep from the laudanum. "Stay here," he mumbled. "I'll want you later." Dinah nodded and sat in the chair by his bed, waiting. Watching him sink into drugged sleep. Waiting for his breathing to slow and deepen. When she was certain he was unconscious, Dinah stood up and quietly left the room. She went to where she'd hidden the rope and the knife. Then she returned. Rousseau was snoring now, dead to the world. Dinah stood over him for a long moment, looking at the man who'd raped her repeatedly for 5 months, who'd treated her like property, despite the law saying she was free, who'd broken something fundamental inside her that would never fully heal. Then she got to work. She tied his hands first, binding them to the bedposts. Used knots she'd learned from watching sailors in New Orleans. Good, tight knots that wouldn't come loose. Then his feet, stretched wide and tied to the bottom posts. Rousseau stirred but didn't wake. The laudanum was doing its job. Dinah finished securing him, then sat back down in the chair and waited for the drug to wear off. It took about an hour. Rousseau came to slowly, groggily, confused about why he couldn't move his arms. Then confused became alarmed as he realized he was tied to his own bed. "What?" he started, then saw Dinah sitting there, the knife in her hand. "What are you doing? Untie me this instant." Dinah didn't move, just looked at him with those hard, cold eyes that had replaced the frightened ones he remembered. "I said untie me!" Rousseau's voice was rising, panic creeping in. He tried to pull free, but the ropes held firm. "You stupid girl," You're going to hang for this. Untie me now, and maybe I'll only have you whipped instead of killed. Dinah stood up slowly, still holding the knife. I'm already dead, she said quietly. You've been killing me piece by piece for 5 months. This is just me finishing the job. But I'm taking you with me. Are you insane? You can't. I can, Dinah interrupted. You made me into something that can do this. You broke all the rules, took away everything that made me want to stay alive. So now there's nothing stopping me. Nothing I care about losing. You did this to yourself. Rousseau stared at her, finally understanding that he was in serious danger. Dinah, listen to me. Whatever I did, whatever you think I did, whatever you think you did, Dinah's voice was still eerily calm. You raped me. 73 times. I counted every single one. 73 times you called me to your room and used my body however you wanted. You beat me when I resisted. You threatened me when I cried. You bought me like I was livestock and treated me worse. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. You thought you could keep doing it because I was powerless, because nobody cared what happened to a freed slave girl, because the law would always protect you over me. And you were right about all of that. But you forgot something. What? Rousseau whispered, his face pale. You forgot that even powerless people can hurt you, especially when they stop caring about consequences. Dinah moved closer to the bed, the knife still in her hand. What are you going to do? Rousseau asked, and now there was real fear in his voice. I'm going to hurt you, Dinah said simply. I'm going to make you feel what I felt, the pain, the fear, the helplessness. I'm going to hurt you until you understand what you did. And then I'm going to keep hurting you until you die. You don't have to do this. I can pay you. I'll free you from your contract, give you money, anything you want. I don't want money. I want you to suffer. And then Dinah began. What happened over the next several hours was never fully detailed in court records, but the examining physician's report provided enough information to paint a horrifying picture. Dinah started with small cuts, shallow wounds that bled but weren't fatal. Arms, legs, chest, face. Rousseau screamed at first, begged, promised everything he could think of. Dinah worked in silence, methodical, patient. She made sure he understood that every cut was payment for every assault. This is for the first time, she'd say, and make a cut. This is for the second time. Another cut. This is for the night you split my lip. Cut. This is for the time you cracked my ribs. Cut. Rousseau's screams eventually brought an overseer to the door, but Dinah had locked it from the inside. By the time they broke through, it was too late. When they finally burst into the room, they found Rousseau tied to his bed, covered in blood, barely conscious, and Dinah sitting in the chair, still holding the knife, covered in his blood, completely calm. He's been punished, she said, for what he did to me, for what he did to all of us. Rousseau died 3 hours later from blood loss and shock. The doctor who examined him said he'd never seen anything like it. Dozens of cuts, all precisely placed to cause maximum pain without immediately killing him. It was torture, pure and simple, calculated, methodical, cruel. Dinah was arrested immediately. They put her in chains, iron ones this time, not economic ones, and took her to the parish jail. The trial began within 2 weeks. Normally it would have been quicker, but the circumstances of the case created unexpected complications. The prosecutor wanted it to be simple. A slave, he kept using that word despite it being legally incorrect, had murdered her master. Death penalty, open and shut. But Dinah's story complicated things. When she was asked why she'd done it, she told the courtroom everything. Every assault, every beating, every humiliation. She described what Rousseau had done in explicit, unflinching detail. Made the jury hear it, made them picture it, made them understand that she'd been systematically tortured for 5 months. Some people in the courtroom were outraged. How dare she speak so graphically in public? But others were disturbed. Even men who had no sympathy for freed slaves were uncomfortable with the idea that Rousseau had been repeatedly raping a 15-year-old girl. The prosecutor tried to argue that her testimony was irrelevant to the murder charge. But Dinah's court-appointed lawyer, a young man from the Freedmen's Bureau who'd taken the case pro bono, argued that it was entirely relevant to understanding why she'd acted. This girl was systematically brutalized by the man she killed, the lawyer argued. She had no legal recourse, no protection, no way out. She was being raped repeatedly by a man who held complete power over her life. Under those circumstances, can we truly say she had any other choice? The prosecutor shot back. She could have reported it to authorities. To what authorities? The defense lawyer demanded. Jean-Baptiste Rousseau was the authority in this parish. His cousin is the sheriff. His friends are the judges. There was no authority that would have protected her, and she knew it. So she protected herself, the only way available to her. By torturing a man to death. By giving him exactly what he gave her, pain, fear, and the knowledge that no one was coming to save him. The argument went back and forth for days. Legal experts debated whether what Dinah had experienced constituted extreme duress that would mitigate the murder charge. Newspaper editorials argued about whether a freed slave had the right to defend herself against her employer's sexual violence. Some papers portrayed Dinah as a monster, a savage who'd committed an unspeakable act of brutality. Others portrayed her as a victim driven to desperate measures by systematic abuse. A few even suggested she was a hero who'd struck back against a rapist when the law wouldn't protect her. The jury was out for 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was guilty of murder in the 1st degree. The judge sentenced her to death by hanging. Dinah showed no reaction when the sentence was read. She'd known from the moment she tied Rousseau to that bed that she was going to die. The only question had been whether it would be worth it. Looking at Rousseau's family crying in the courtroom, seeing the fear in their eyes as they realized that even someone as powerless as a 15-year-old freed slave could reach up and hurt them. Yes, it had been worth it. The execution was scheduled for October 15th, 1869. Between the sentencing and the execution, Dinah became something of a cause célèbre. Abolitionists used her case as an example of how freed slaves were still being exploited. Women's rights advocates pointed to it as evidence that women had no legal protection from sexual violence. Even some Southern newspapers, uncomfortable with the brutality of what Rousseau had done, questioned whether execution was the appropriate response. But Louisiana in 1869 wasn't interested in complicated questions about justice and abuse. The law was clear. Dinah had murdered a white man. The penalty was death. The morning of the execution, thousands of people came to watch, the largest crowd anyone could remember for a hanging. Some came out of morbid curiosity. Some came because they thought Dinah deserved it. Others came to bear witness, to show solidarity with a girl who'd fought back when no one else would fight for her. They brought Dinah out at 10 o'clock. She was 16 now, had spent 6 months in jail, awaiting and going through her trial and appeals. She looked even younger than 15, tiny and frail in the white dress they'd given her for the execution. The executioner asked if she had any last words. Dinah looked out at the crowd, saw white faces eager for her death, saw black faces sad and proud and angry, saw women who understood, who knew what it meant to be powerless against men who wanted to hurt you. "I'm not sorry," she said, her voice steady. "Master Rousseau raped me 73 times. He beat me. He treated me like I was still a slave, even though the law said I was free. He hurt me in ways I can't even describe to you." The crowd murmured. Some told her to be quiet. Others told those people to shut up and let her speak. "I killed him," Dinah continued, "and I'm glad I did. The only thing I regret is that I couldn't make him suffer longer. If I could do it again, I would, because he deserved every second of pain I gave him." She paused, then added, "You're going to hang me for fighting back, for refusing to accept being raped over and over. You're going to kill me for defending myself when the law wouldn't defend me. That tells you everything you need to know about whose side the law is on. And I want every girl out there who's being hurt like I was hurt to know this. You can fight back. They might kill you for it, like they're killing me, but at least you'll die knowing you didn't just accept it. That you made them pay, that you mattered enough to be worth revenge. That's worth dying for. That's worth everything." The executioner put the noose around her neck. Dinah didn't cry, didn't beg, just stood straight, her head high, her eyes clear. They pulled the lever. Dinah dropped. Her neck broke cleanly. At least they'd done that much for her, made it quick instead of slow strangulation. The crowd was silent. Then slowly some people began to clap. Others joined in. Within moments, half the crowd, mostly black people and some white women, were applauding a dead 16-year-old girl who'd tortured her rapist to death and been hanged for it. The authorities were furious, ordered the crowd to disperse, made arrests for disrupting public order. But the message had been sent. Dinah's execution was supposed to be a warning about what happened to people who fought back. Instead, it became a rallying cry. In the days after the hanging, stories began to circulate. Other women came forward with accounts of being raped by employers, by landowners, by men who held economic power over them. The stories had always been there, but Dinah's case made them visible in a way they hadn't been before. Editorials debated whether the legal system had failed Dinah, or whether she'd failed the legal system by taking justice into her own hands. The question was never fully resolved. What was clear was that Dinah's story wouldn't be forgotten. Newspapers across the country covered it. Anti-slavery activists used it in their work. Women's rights advocates cited it as evidence that women needed better legal protections. And in the freed slave communities across the South, people told Dinah's story as a cautionary tale and an inspiration. Cautionary because look what happened when you fought back. Inspiration because at least she'd fought back. A folk song emerged, passed through the quarters in freedmen's communities. Dinah was her name, just 16 years old, taken and used by a master of old. 73 times he hurt her, they say, until Dinah decided he'd pay, tied him down tight, made him understand what it felt like to be under someone's hand, cut him slow, made him scream and cry. Now Dinah's in heaven and Rousseau's where he should lie. The song spread across Louisiana, then to other states. Authorities tried to suppress it, arrested people for singing it in public, claimed it was inciting violence. But you can't arrest a song. It lived on, passed down through generations. Historians later debated whether Dinah's case represented justice or vigilantism. Some argued that she'd had no choice, that the system had failed her so completely that violence was her only option. Others insisted that no matter the provocation, torture and murder couldn't be justified. What's not debatable is what Dinah represented: the absolute failure of law and society to protect the most vulnerable. She was technically free, but freedom meant nothing when economic bondage and sexual violence were legal, or at least unpunished. The image we have of Dinah, young, serious, with those piercing eyes that had seen too much, captures something essential. She's not bowed or broken, even with the metaphorical chains of her situation all around her. Her expression is defiant, unrepentant. That's what made her case so disturbing to white society. They wanted her to be sorry, to acknowledge that she'd done something wrong. Instead, she stood on the gallows and said she'd do it again. That kind of defiance, from someone they considered beneath them, was terrifying. Because if a 15-year-old freed slave girl could fight back so effectively, who else might decide that the cost of revenge was worth paying? Today, there's a small marker in the cemetery where Dinah was buried. It's in an unmarked section. She wasn't allowed to be buried in consecrated ground because she'd been executed for murder. But in the 1960s, during the civil rights movement, activists placed a marker. Dinah, 1853-1869, she fought back. It's simple, doesn't explain the full story. But maybe that's enough, because Dinah's story is complicated, uncomfortable, challenging. It doesn't provide easy answers about justice or right and wrong. What it does provide is a window into what life was like for freed slaves in the post-war South. The lie of freedom, the reality of continued exploitation, the complete absence of legal protection for people who were supposedly citizens with rights. And it provides an example, extreme, brutal, probably not replicable, of what happens when you push someone past the breaking point. When you take away all hope, all options, all reasons to submit peacefully. Dinah's revenge was cruel. That's not in dispute. What she did to Jean-Baptiste Rousseau was torture, plain and simple. She made him suffer for hours, made him understand what he'd done, made him pay for every assault with physical pain. Was it justified? That's a question each person has to answer for themselves. The law said no. The jury said no. The executioner said no by putting that noose around her neck. But the crowd that applauded her death said yes. The women who came forward with their own stories of abuse said yes. The freed slaves who sang songs about her said yes. And Dinah herself, standing on those gallows, said yes with every word of her final statement. So what do you think? Was Dinah a murderer who deserved execution, or a victim who fought back the only way she could? Did she commit an atrocity, or did she deliver justice when the system wouldn't? These aren't abstract questions. They're about how we understand resistance, about what we owe to victims of systematic abuse, about where the line is between justified self-defense and unforgivable cruelty. If you believe these stories matter, the dark ones, the ones that make us uncomfortable, the ones that don't have heroes and villains, but just broken people, doing broken things in a broken system, then remember Dinah. Remember that she was 15 years old when Jean-Baptiste Rousseau started raping her. Remember that she had no legal recourse, no protection, no way out. Remember that she endured 73 assaults before she decided to fight back. Remember that her revenge was cruel, calculated, designed to cause maximum suffering. Remember that she showed no remorse, said she'd do it again, stood on the gallows, and defended her actions. Remember all of it. The abuse and the revenge, the torture and the execution, the crowd that applauded a dead teenager, the system that punished her for defending herself while doing nothing to punish the man who'd raped her repeatedly. That's the complete picture. That's the truth that needs remembering. Because forgetting would be the final injustice, to let Dinah's suffering be erased. Her resistance be dismissed, her humanity be denied one more time. She deserves better. They all deserved better. And we owe them at least the honesty of remembering the full, complicated, disturbing truth. Slaves' cruelest revenge. Not cruelest because it was so brutal, though it was. Cruelest because it was necessary. Because it was the only form of justice available to a girl who'd been systematically destroyed by someone the law considered respectable. That's the real cruelty, not what Dinah did, but what was done to her that made her actions seem like the only option. Remember her name. Remember her story. Remember that in 1869, 4 years after slavery supposedly ended, a girl was being raped repeatedly under the protection of law, and when she fought back, the law killed her for it. That's America's shame. That's the legacy we carry. That's the truth that demands remembering, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us. Dinah fought back, and they hanged her for it. Make sure that story doesn't die with her.